Welcome everyone to the 65th meeting of Soteria, and the title for today is Does Anyone Remember F.R. Leavis? Subtitled The Rise and Fall of the Leavis Phenomenon, introduced by Heward Wilkinson, whom I think we all know. And that subject is close to my heart because I find it personally a very interesting one. And I think this will be a very interesting and thought-provoking meeting. Over to you, Heward.
Let me commence, just for fun, by my first note on the 19th of November 1964, when I first met at his invitation, because I'd written to him F.R. Leavis, and this is what I wrote. Up at 8:30 and off to Leavis at 9 o'clock, or a bit before. He answered the door, a small, bronzed, austere, sharp-faced man in open-necked flannel T-shirt, slightly golfy trousers, and a flannel or tweed grey jacket of a warm colour. "Ah, you're the man from Trinity Hall." I followed him in and sat down and wrote down the oracle's words. His delivery seemed a bit odd at first, but one got used to it almost instantly. I take verbatim notes as far as possible, which I treasure, of course, and in them is found lacking that austere, clarifying, lucid delivery, just eccentric enough to be warm, the really quality perception of a really great critic. So that was a snapshot, a mental snapshot, as I later came to realize, of Leavis, and the absence of a tie was absolutely normal. Can you see above my, I think it would be my right-hand side, where the cat is? Can you see the photograph of F.R. Leavis there?
Yes, I can.
That, to the best of my knowledge, is the only photograph of Leavis in his latter years not wearing a tie. That's because it was taken when he was awarded the emeritus professorship at the University of York. So that, as it were, is two glimpses of Leavis in his very peculiar, vivid sense, the identity that came across. Now, he is a paradox in more than one way. The first reason he's a paradox is that, having framed the whole situation of English literature in the 20th century, at least the core of it, because obviously he had his negations, he had his no's very strongly, but nevertheless, he had his affirmative framework, and that affirmative framework contained both English literature as poetry, principally expressed in new bearings in English poetry, and in the volume entitled Revaluation. There's also a very considerable amount in the book that I was introduced to by somebody who was part of the enterprise that Leavis had engaged in of involving school teachers the world over, at least within the British Commonwealth, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and so on, and also in Britain and to some extent in Ireland as well. And that a magnificent effort, which was aided and abetted by Dennis Thompson, was a quite extraordinary achievement, which more or less happened of itself. And yes, at the same time, it worked very powerfully. It created the standards and values of English literature, even when you disagreed with Leavis. It was Leavis you were disagreeing with, so to speak. He shaped the dialogue, and that dialogue went on in all of the Commonwealth countries and also in Britain, as Scotland, as well as England itself and Wales, and also Ireland. So it was a very, very powerful process. But the second thing that needs to be said, and I will come back to the first thing in a moment. The second thing that needs to be said is that it was all overturned when postmodernism swept into the academic world in Britain and indeed in America and so forth. And if you want to get a flavor of that transition, then read David Lodge's book, Nice Work. And there are three parts of the book altogether that he wrote, which are entitled the Campus Trilogy. They have three parts. And in the 60s, David Lodge had written a very full book on the Leavises, and he was basically in the Leavises camp. But of course, what he was doing in the Campus Trilogy was mapping the transition, in effect, between the world of F.R. Leavis and the world of postmodernism. And it's a very interesting process he manages to do. So I will leave it there for the moment and come back to F.R. Leavis. But the key point at this point was that the whole framework that Leavis had created was, as it were, how can I put it? It was irrigated by postmodernism. The whole landscape was irrigated by postmodern attitudes. And at that point, Leavis became considered old-fashioned, passé. And in many ways, he was entirely forgotten, in my view, in that time. I was part of an activity which involved trying to set up an organization, or not entirely surprisingly, called the Leavis Society. And when I, as is my contrarian way, sought to provide an issue of the the Leavis Society monograph, or whatever we called it, that actually suggested and dared to suggest that what Leavis was up to in, for example, his understandings of poems like Marvell's dialogue of body and soul, or indeed the most famous one, To His Coy Mistress, when what Leavis was up to in analysing those poems in the depth that he was fully capable of doing was compatible with postmodernism and compatible in particular with Derridean analyses of what Leavis would have called enactment at one point in the 60s. I was suggesting that Derrida's whole way of thinking is based on enactment, and therefore there's not an incompatibility between what Leavis was up to and what Derrida was up to. Well, that killed off the Leavis Society journal. The reaction to it was so vehement and so dismissive that and sarcastic that it probably harmed my professional reputation to some extent at that time. So that was one paradox, but nevertheless, particularly if you read the fight between the two protagonists in Nice Work, the industrialist and the academic, where Lodge couches the denouements of the whole book in terms of 19th century ways of breaking free of the trap that the particular way of thinking had got into, such as dependent on a legacy. The Nice Work ends with a legacy that I won't. I don't. If any of you have not read it, it's most delightful. But nevertheless, he's clearly teasing us by writing a pseudo 19th century novel in the world of postmodernism. And there's something about that paradox that is highly relevant to Leavis as such, because Leavis knew and greatly admired, although criticized, all two of the three of them. He knew three people whom he considered geniuses. And those people were T.F. Paris, the brother of John Cowper Paris, who wrote very vast novels, as you probably know. But T.F. Paris wrote very tight, well-crafted, almost miniature works, but very remarkable works, which I'll come back to in a little while when we consider Leavis's relationship with Christianity. So that was T.F. Paris was one. The second was T.S. Eliot, and about T.S. Eliot, Leavis has a lifelong, an enormous amount to say, and he gradually becomes more and more disillusioned with Eliot, but he never ceases to think that Eliot was one of the geniuses that he knew, even though on one particular occasion when Eliot sought to visit them and plead for Leavis not to attack him in public but for his association with Bloomsbury and the world of the media of that particular time and so forth. And Mrs. Leavis saw him off the premises. Mrs. Leavis was a quite extraordinarily formidable person. And it's an interesting fact that the fourth genius that Leavis appeals to is one he never met, one who died before he was fully able to come to grips with him and had even sought the possibility of meeting with him, which I imagine he would have done if he could have done. And that, of course, was D.H. Lawrence. And the third of the four geniuses was Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein was sufficiently formidable and arrogant and dismissive that when he was comparing himself with Wittgenstein, Leavis kind of took the view that he was not a genius. And yet many people in this volume about the Leavises, which I'll show you, that's a very, very late and not very good photograph, but there are some better ones inside it. At least about 50% of the writers about Leavis in that volume consider he was a genius. But if he was a genius, he was a most peculiar genius in certain ways that he did not, he took for granted what he had done, but he was not ego invested in it, but particularly in the latter years, his ego was invested in public contests with other people, and he was very vehement. And of course, some of you will know that most notoriously he engaged with a very profound intensity in a demolition job on C.P. Snow, later Lord Snow, and a member of the Harold Wilson Labour government of 1964 and of 1966 when Wilson was elected with a larger majority. So Leavis had his map, and his map was a map, but broadly speaking, in poetry, it stemmed from Shakespeare and the metaphysical poets such as Donne and Marvell and various others. And secondly, it had a recrudescence at the time of the emergence of Romanticism, and Leavis is very ambiguous about the Romantics. Probably his greatest intensity of approbation goes to Wordsworth, and he has a tendency to underestimate the other Romantics, but he doesn't dismiss them. He's very cautious about them. For example, Keats. He undoubtedly thinks that Keats was a genius, but he thinks that Keats overindulges himself in his poetry and that aspects of it are overly self-indulgent. and he was very sharp on anything of that sort. And he was also very, very profoundly interested in what happened in the 18th century. He thought that Alexander Pope was a belated metaphysical poet, which I think there's a case for. And secondly, he thought that in terms of the achievement of a consonance with the world, the public world of the 18th century, that the poetry of Samuel Johnson in particular, not London, but the Vanity of Human Wishes, was absolutely supreme 18th century poetry, but nevertheless as far as possible from Donne and Marvell as it could possibly be, because it was whereas in the world of metaphysicals there is a profound understanding of the private worlds of the writers and the beloveds or mistresses or whoever that they are communicating with. Nevertheless, Johnson's poetry is completely out in the open and in the public realm. And Johnson was clearly at home with the entire civilization of his time. George Steiner, anybody remember George Steiner? George Steiner remarked that the muses in English, the muses have only created 2 doctorates. And those doctorates were Dr. Johnson and Dr. Leavis, because at the time when Leavis was in his prime, and even when he was heading towards his final phase, everyone knew him as Dr. Leavis, because he was never given a professorship at Cambridge. And of course, the picture above me there is the recognition of the fact that he got the emeritus professorship at the University of York. And that was a very important step for him, because he was Cambridge through and through. But of course, he felt profoundly betrayed by Cambridge, particularly more in his later years. And so he was ready to go to pastures new if they were made available to him, which they certainly were. And
Heward, sorry, I should have asked you this at the beginning. Do you want to take any questions during your speech, or would you like to keep everything until the end?
I think I would like to give the kind of roadmap I'm trying to give, and finish on at a quarter to, what would it be? A quarter to, it's 6:18 now, so it would be a quarter to 7.
Yeah, well, whatever you wish, whatever you wish.
Well, yes, I wish to keep it brief.
Yeah.
Because the essence of it can be conveyed quite briefly, because it's so weird. The weirdness of Leavis's own work was that he was a genius, but he didn't know it. He always behaved as if he was not a genius. But anyone who talked to him for 20 minutes knew if they were open to it, and of course many people weren't open to it, knew he was a genius. So he, unlike Wittgenstein, who was melodramatically a genius and pretty well announced the same when Leavis and him met, and Wittgenstein had made a characteristically contemptuous remark about a young man who was in the gathering that they were both at, and Leavis challenged him and basically said, "You're being cruel. You were totally cruel, unacceptably cruel to that young man." And Wittgenstein's reaction, of course, was very interesting. He said, "I think I want to know you." In other words, he in some sense recognized Leavis as someone, even though he treated him contemptuously quite a lot of the time, and Leavis got used to it, and got used to Wittgenstein keeping up at all times of night. This is all in a book published later, towards the end of Leavis's life, which is entitled The Literary Critic as Anti-Philosopher. And that perhaps in a way epitomizes a very great deal of what this is all about. Okay, so let's bear in mind that when he was creating his roadmap connected with the sequence of English poetry, broadly speaking, from Shakespeare, but to some extent it would include Chaucer as well, and possibly Langland. It was a roadmap that went via the metaphysicals and the later 17th century, and then, as it were, turned itself upside down in the 18th century with the dramatic exception of Alexander Pope, and then transformed itself again in a complexly ambiguous acknowledgement of the Romantics. And then, of course, we have poets that Leavis doesn't think are have the, to quote Gerard Manley Hopkins, the naked thew and sinew of the English language in them, like Tennyson in particular. And Leavis's portrayal of the 19th century is, broadly speaking, as a time of decline, even though he, to some extent, gives an honourable minor exception to Arthur Hugh Clough, the author of Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth, The Labour and the Wounds are Vain, The Enemy Faints Not nor Faileth, and As Things Have Been They Remain, etc., which Leavis quoted at the end of his retrospect of Scrutiny. And here I now come to Scrutiny. Scrutiny was kept going primarily by Leavis, but secondarily by Mrs. Leavis and one or two assiduous contributors when they weren't away at the war, such as Elsie Knights, at one period Muriel Bradbrook, and Harding, the author of I can't remember the name of it. It'll come back to me. But it was his contribution to Jane Austen studies. As I say, it will come back to me. Scrutiny was kept going for over 20 years, including during the Second World War. and most of the early versions of Leavis's books and the contributions that went into the books, as in the great tradition of the novel, and as the various pieces that were formed revaluation, all went into the books. And so it was a colossal undertaking. It was very much connected with the development that I talked about earlier of the world of the Commonwealth school teachers, whom I encountered when I was at Cranleigh School. My English teacher that had the most influence on me was G.P. Maguire, George Maguire, and he was of Irish origins, but he had been part of British intelligence during the Second World War, and I can't remember the name of his more famous colleague, but he was a very, very shrewd and astute man who had been through the Mincer, and as someone who had been through the Mincer, he recognized in Leavis someone who had also been through the Mincer. And of course, I mean, if we want to just a couple of facts about Leavis in this connection. The first one was that on the very day that Leavis took his finals at Cambridge, his father fell dead. So Leavis scraped through, but under the handicap of taking the exam in the face of that, the immediate impact of that bereavement. During the First World War, Leavis was one of those who came to the conclusion that this was not a war one could fight in. It was a catastrophe, and it was not an expression of a kind of patriotism that Leavis wanted to endorse, even though there are passages in one or two of the works where he makes it very clear that the ordinary English Tommy, he had a very high admiration for, and he once, in a situation where the soldiers in the Second World War were being dismissed, he once almost pleadingly said, "But they were brave." But what happened to Leavis was he became an ambulance man during the First World War. So he was not part of the fighting, but he saw the consequences of it all. And of course, the war poets, he knew exactly what they were writing about. The likes of Siegfried Sassoon and so on. And so he was in it, but kind of not part of it. But he came back traumatized, and he gradually nursed himself back into some kind of connection with learning. And he did what belatedly was a very significant thing. He took a doctorate in history. So he became Dr. Leavis. It was not in literature, it was in history. And of course, he always had a most profound historical understanding of history. And I will now tell one or two little anecdotes. he was, there were people who were, as it were, on the semi-blacklist. The author of Madame Bovary was on the blacklist, and of the later works of that author. And what you discovered was that all the people he talked about, and maybe in some way delimited or mocked, he'd read them. He'd read everything. He knew Dante by heart, and when he couldn't get to sleep, he sometimes recited Dante to himself. And he knew the ones whom he felt were had not got the kind of fullness of life affirmation that he saw in Jane Austen, in George Eliot, and Henry James, and in D.H. Lawrence, and that equally he saw in John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Wordsworth at his best, and so on and so forth. All that mapping that he did, which was, as it were, waiting for the postmodernists to turn upside down, was done in the wake of very considerable traumatization, but it was also done under the auspices of a profound historical understanding, which was far broader than anyone recognized that he had, because he was always assumed to be narrow, and he thought that D.H. Lawrence was the greatest critic of the century, and yet he recognized that the real pioneer in criticism in the 20th century had been T.S. Eliot, about whom he was very, very ambivalent indeed. And he was the first person seriously, other than the poet laureate, whose name I forget, to put Gerard Manley Hopkins on the map. Now, you probably know that Gerard Manley Hopkins submitted his first long poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland, to the Society of Jesus, of which he was a member. He was based at Roehampton, in fact, doing his priestly training. And he submitted The Wreck of the Deutschland to the Society of Jesus, and they turned it down. And no single poem of his was published during his lifetime. We have some quite extraordinary letters, and he had 2 or 3 poetic admirers who really didn't know what he was up to at all. The first person really to put him on the map was, because even the poet laureate, whose name I've forgotten, altered his poetry when he first published it somewhere around 2017, I think it was, at least 40 years after Hopkins's death. he actually altered some of the passages that he thought were improper pieces of poetry. Leavis pays enormous attention to it in new bearings in English poetry, and I think he doesn't entirely assess Hopkins adequately, but of course we have the ambiguity that he is an anti-Christian. Leavis is an anti-Christian. Yet, all the authors that he most admires are basically Christians. Wittgenstein is a Christian in a rather odd fashion, but nevertheless, he's a kind of Christian. T.F. Paris is not only a Christian, but in the wonderful book, Mr. Weston's Good Wine, the title of which is taken from the passage in J.L. Austen's Emma, where Mr. Elton is about to pay court to Emma, and she's trying to head him off because she is convinced he's going to be talking nonsense because he has drunk too much of Mr. Weston's good wine. So T.F. Paris took that title for his book, but if anybody has ever read it, you will find that God Almighty appears as one of the dramatis personae in the book in a most intriguing way. And but nevertheless, he walks on stage, and it is clear that in his own way, T.F. Paris is a Christian to his toenails and to his fingertips. So there we have it, that Leavis is engaged with four geniuses, and he recognizes there's a profound relationship with Christianity in D.H. Lawrence, because he goes on at great length attacking T.S. Eliot, who accuses Lawrence of lacking a connection with a viable tradition of culture. And Leavis says that when Lawrence and his friends, and including the author of the memoir, E.L., when Lawrence is growing up and going to college, he was part of a community of learning which was very, very profound. And it was a religious community of learning. It was Protestant. It was, it wasn't Presbyterian. What was the one? I can't remember exactly which one it was. But it was, as it were, it was working class, but it was an educated sense of tradition that Lawrence was born into. And what basically Leavis says was that, in effect, just filling the gaps in his account, that the fact that Lawrence was born into a working class culture, but as it were an educated working class culture, which was sufficiently available to him that he was able to get an education and have an educated community. Congregationalism, it's come back to me. It sometimes does. I'm on beta blockers at the present time, you see. And they've just moved me onto a slightly less ferocious one. And so my memory is starting to come back. But because of that, Leavis thinks that, of course, there are elements of his own background in this. He thinks that Lawrence was gifted a gift from the gods by being working class in a portion of the working class that had a live religious tradition to draw on. If you want to get the feel of that tradition, the account of Christmas in D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow is the place to go. A quite extraordinary and profoundly moving passage. And at the same time, epitomizing the transition that was coming over England at that particular time. Now, I've got 5 more minutes. I now want to clinch the paradox. Well, there are several paradoxes. Leavis is a religious, very profoundly religious person, and all the 4 people that he is drawing on as his icons, T.F. Paris, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, they are all either Christians or so profoundly enmeshed with Christianity that you could probably say of them, they may not be Christians, but they're not a Christian, if you like. And likewise, the paradox of Leavis is an anti-Christian who is incredibly profoundly religious, whose understanding of the whole literary tradition is that it is all pervaded by understandings of religion, whether they be Catholic, as in the case of Hopkins, or Protestant, as in the case of Lawrence's upbringing in the context of Congregationalism. But Leavis every so often raps his knuckles by protesting at the use by convinced Christians of this or that author. And I will finish my account of him. This extraordinary man who was a genius who didn't fully know he was a genius, but which anyone whose heart was open to him knew was an astounding genius. This man who was so unexpected in this paradoxical way. I used to go and sit at his feet because after he'd given the Richmond lecture criticizing C.P. Snow, he stood back. That was his time of retirement, and he went on to the emeritus professorships, and he wrote a whole series of polemical works about what was missing, was about what the kind of frankness that was missing in the modern world, which had the Blakean title of Nor Shall My Sword, a very intriguing book, but a bit mad as well, a bit over the top. But I used to go and listen to him, and sometimes I would just be enraptured by the subtle connections that he was making. And for example, he remarked just casually, he obviously had read him and knew what he was talking about. And that was Kant. He said, you know all about Kant, don't you? Of course, I knew nothing about Kant, but I made sure I now know a lot about Kant, partly because of that remark of Dr. Leavis's and other influences. But there it is. But anyway, that was the sort of thing. And one of his bête noirs of Eliot's was a book called After Strange Gods, which he thought was um, uh, a really mean and impossible and disgraceful attack on D.H. Lawrence, even though it had some good things in it. And he reviews it in the Common Pursuit. But I hadn't got a copy of it when I was at Cambridge and going to sit at his feet. So I asked him if I might borrow the book, you see. And he took it down from the shelf. And he basically advised me not to be corrupted by it. He was very Victorian in certain ways. But underneath that, there he was, the genius that we all knew was a genius, and that didn't entirely know that he himself was a genius, which I think contributed very greatly to the degree of venomousness that infected his latter years. And I've now reached a 6:45, so I'll stop and we can open it all up.
So, thank you very much, Heward, for sharing your profound admiration and I think love for this man.
Yes, it was love.
Yeah, who clearly lit up a generation with his vision of what literature was. If I may, could you? I'd like to ask you to try to describe this canon that he had in such a way that I can use it to assess works which I don't know his opinion about, and then come up with the understanding. Oh yes, he'd have liked that or not. Because at the moment, I'm not sure I can do that. I can think of a lot of works, and I think I've no idea really whether he liked them or not. I've heard the specific judgments that he had, but I mean, could you try to put it in a more general way so I could kind of use it like that? Thank you.
It's a very tricky one because, of course,
maybe it's not easy to do, and maybe it can't be done, and if so, that's fine.
Well, I think we can do it with revaluation and new bearings for poetry, and we can do it for the novel with the great tradition and with D.H. Lawrence novelist. And basically what he thinks that the French novelists lack, and that T.S. Eliot in part lacks, is a certain kind of profound life affirmation, which he finds in people like John Donne, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and particularly the great tragedies, and the Winter's Tale is very, very important to him. Not so much the Tempest, although that's very interesting, of course, why he doesn't go with the Tempest. But we can come back to those things if we can. But and also had we but world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find, and I can't remember the next line. But the wit and ambiguity, the systematic ambiguity of someone like Marvell in those poems is absolutely fascinating to Leavis, and he's very good at analyzing it. And that is a centerpiece of his whole understanding of English poetic literature. But he's very interested in the oddities, particularly he thinks that Pope, as I've said, Pope has, although Pope is vitriolic, Pope has the force of life that the metaphysical poets had through the incredible subtlety of his wit and so forth. And he thinks that Johnson had it because Johnson remains a wit in his poetry, even though his poetry is completely consonant with 18th century values. And Leavis is intrigued by the fact that something so totally opposed to, say, Coleridge's poems, his conversation poems like Frost at Midnight, as private and intimate poems, that Johnson could virtually not write such a thing. And there it is. But the ambiguity continues when we get to the Romantic poets. The nearest to a solid presence in the whole pantheon from the Romantic period is Wordsworth, in particular Tintern Abbey, Michael, and the Prelude. So it's a particular, if you like, he would have rejected this characterization as a trivialization, but it's a particular kind of life force that these works have that the French novelists in particular don't have, but that he occasionally discovers in someone unexpected. In his latter years, he discovered the poetry in Italian of Montale, which he thought very highly of indeed. And I think he actually met with Montale. I'm not absolutely certain of that. So broadly speaking, that is the map. He thinks that George Eliot has that. He thinks, despite D.H. Lawrence's carping at Jane Austen, he thinks Jane Austen has that, with which I agree with him. He thinks that George Eliot has it, as I said. He thinks that Henry James has it, although his position on Henry James gradually evolves. And he definitely thinks that D.H. Lawrence has it, even though his highly formidable wife dislikes D.H. Lawrence because at some level she thought he was a bit of a dirty man.
It was.
Janine, please speak. I was thinking of your works in particular, Janine, which I thought were very good, and what he would have thought of those. And I don't know at all. But anyway, please go ahead.
I have a question. You used the term genius and life force, and I put those things together, and I'm thinking, what was his definition of genius? What criteria did he lay out? And it sounds like what you're saying is sort of like pornography. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And so his term and designation of these people as geniuses, could you give maybe three components of what to him constituted genius in writing? And the reason I ask the question is, it seems like because if he was in World War I, and he obviously must have been a young man if he went on to World War II and then beyond that. And I'm wondering if his terms of genius changed because of his war experiences, or whether it was consistent in terms of like the Ten Commandments. These are the three components of that you've got to have to be considered a genius?
I think they did evolve, but sometimes they got so caught up with his attacks on all of his bêtes noires that you could miss the underlying communication that was going on. I came to the conclusion, and as I said during the talk, that what at one point in the 60s he labels enactment, he says that a poem like the dialogue between body and soul enacts and not merely states what it is communicating. This is one major element. But you see, I think there's a problem here because at the end of the paper by I think it is D.W. Harding. Yes, it is. He says, Harding writes, it was part of his identity in which he took some pride, liking to remark, for instance, that being able to swim 50 yards underwater was a help in reading Swinburne aloud. But he never allowed it to imply a reproach to a non-athletic like me. He was wonderingly tolerant. This is the key remark I'm quoting. He was wonderingly tolerant of the inert relaxation I found in reading detective stories. No cheap literature was any relief or distraction to him. When he was making journeys to Norwich, where Queenie, his wife, was having treatment for radiation burns, he told me the only thing he could find to absorb him in the train was reading and repondering the Shakespeare sonnets. In other words, he had a classical canon which excluded what was not part of that classical canon, which he thought was not life-affirming enough, which was a not Christian classical canon, because it was clear he was an atheist. He was absolutely not a Christian, and he thought that most Christian writing was bilgewater, bluntly. The final argument he has, which is in D.H. Lawrence Novelist, with a book by Father Tiverton, he treats the endeavors to bring to bear Christian belief system commentary on works like Lawrence's or Hopkins's. He thinks that's a travesty and that usually it's absolute bilgewater. And he uses Tiverton as he uses Eliot's preface as a demonstration that Eliot still has a problem with Lawrence. So there's something profound going on between those he considers either too trivial to bother with, like detective stories, or too nihilistic, and there he's thinking particularly of the French novelistic tradition, and now I've remembered the name of the author of Madame Bovary, Flaubert. So I'm not sure I can give you those definitions because I think they actually break down. So, for example, I'm an aficionado of Isaac Asimov's writings, which
Ah,
I think are very profound in various ways. I have no doubt whatsoever that Leavis wouldn't have touched them with a barge pole. He'd have thought them in the same category as Harding's detective stories. And I noticed that when Hardy mentions his reading of detective stories, he doesn't defend it at all. He thinks it's an inert habit. Whereas for me, um, the Asimov books and some of Forsyth's books, for me, are very profound. I don't have to approve of everything that either of them write to get
right.
something from it. I know how to cherry pick. I think here is probably a useful addition to our attempt at a set of three. Leavis doesn't know how to cherry pick.
Ah,
Where he thinks that something is off his radar, he may have read it, but nevertheless he disparages it.
mm-hmm.
Um, so, what's the second major novel of Flaubert's? I just can't remember the name of it.
I
Anybody?
think of Madame Bovary, yeah.
Well, Madame Bovary is a famous one, but Sentimental Education. Another victory.
Excellent.
L'éducation sentimentale, which is, I would say, a life-affirming book, but in a different way from the way in which the major parts of Middlemarch are, for example.
Michael, sorry.
No, done.
Michael, I'm sure you've got a question.
Yeah, I almost don't know where to start, but I would start with a sort of positive comment. I picked you up, Heward, when you said that Leavis had read them. I found that a terribly significant statement. It's a little bit what we seek to do in Soteria, is actually to go back to the text and actually read them, instead of either praising or dismissing things that maybe one has forgotten what they actually contain or what their value may be. And I thought it was interesting, that connection with postmodernism and the idea that you go deep into a text before you make a statement in its favor or against it. And I think that's absolutely something I personally very much agree with. And also, to your comment here about cherry picking, one could make the amusing remark that he was very dismissive of C.P. Snow and his novels, but had he actually read C.P. Snow's novels?
Yes, he had.
Oh, he had. Had he really?
Yes.
My little
Because
knowledge of Leavis, I had the impression he hadn't. Yeah.
He comments on the masters
in
the Snow diatribe, and he says that represents basically what Snow is all about. His ego is invested in being the master of a college, or alternatively a member of Harold Wilson's government, and so on and so forth. He's concerned with status.
Yeah, and I suppose
I'm not saying he'd read the whole damn lot, but nevertheless, he'd certainly.
Well, that is extremely interesting, because surely C.P. Snow is somebody who's very personally and emotionally engaged in his writing, and that's what Leavis distrusted, and that is what I sometimes personally admire. I mean, I think The Masters is a fascinating book. It's a sort of mini genius in its way, because how can you make it interesting? And it is fascinating. Who is going to be elected master to a college that actually doesn't exist? And it takes place in the 1930s. And you are absolutely gripped by who is going to be elected master to this theoretical non-existent college anyway 100 years ago. And yet Snow does it. I think nearly everybody who reads The Masters is absolutely gripped. And of course, that goes back to detective stories. I mean, there's so much one could say about that. I would like to pick up one thing because I have ambivalent feelings about Leavis, frankly, in the same way that he had about T.S. Eliot, as you describe it. Janine's question about a genius was one of my questions as well. And I think there are three words that come up for me. And I think Leavis uses all three of them. Correct me if I'm wrong. One is great, one is important, and one is genius. And I am a little bit suspicious of all these myself because I think, do people subject those words to the kind of analysis and scrutiny which Leavis demanded from his students when they read a novel? In other words, if he says that a novelist is important, does he subject the word important to the same scrutiny as he would expect somebody to apply to a novel by James or D.H. Lawrence? And I have a sort of feeling, my impression is that he doesn't. And I have enormous problems with the word important and great because I don't know what great means, and people use it, they throw it out all the time. He's great. And in politics, this is great, it's a great deal, things like that. A great person, a great man. And important, I find even worse because how can a novel be important? What does that even mean? I mean, I understand if you say this is an important development in fighting cancer because it's relevant to cancer. But what is an important novel? And if I have a criticism of Leavis in a general way, I have the feeling he doesn't subject those words. But I'm speaking from the point of view of some ignorance because I'm not in any way somebody who's read a lot of these.
Can I cut in?
Absolutely, I've almost finished. I was just going to say that he doesn't repeat myself. Yeah.
I just want to tell you, he's certainly guilty as charged in this respect. And I think he does something with the word genius when I mean, if you ever had the privilege of listening to Leavis make the kind of detailed connections that he was able to make when he was at his most inspired, and he could be sitting in front of three undergraduates, one of whom was his son, the second of whom was a bit dense, but a nice chap, and the third, which of course was the impossible to categorize Heward Wilkinson. And he would give of as profound a depth of analysis with us three, with incredible courtesy, the grace and courtesy with which he treated us. Of course, we were subordinates. And what you normally found was if you, as it were, if you parted company with Leavis in his latter years, you would be rejected, or were quite likely to be rejected. Though he never rejected Harding, for example. And he was very wary about L.C. Knights, but nevertheless, he didn't entirely reject him. But I'm still looking for an affirmative third word. My second word for Janine was a negative, namely he doesn't cherry pick, which is part of the paradox of the fact that the things that he affirms as if, as it were, they were the Holy Grail handed down from heaven. So there's a positive corresponding to the negative of he doesn't cherry pick.
Right.
And in respect of Harding's comment about detective stories and the fact that on the train, Leavis is stuck with his old classic, with Shakespeare, the sonnets. Now, of course, he's continuing to read the sonnets, and almost certainly on that train journey, he discovered new things in the sonnets that he'd never noticed before. He was doing that right to the very end, and he had the capacity for that. But it's as if once he'd set the fence up round this whole matrix that he created, which was the one to attack thereafter, whether you liked it or not. It did the job. But once he'd ring-fenced the matrix, he would misuse words in the way that Michael is indicating to describe the elements of those outside, and he would also misuse the words in order to describe, I mean, as it were, suppose we ask the question, is Shakespeare important? It's a laughable question in a sense, isn't it? Of course he's important. He's so overwhelmingly important that the word important vanishes as we use it. So when Leavis is using the word important, which I think, for example, he does about T.F. Powys, he's using it to emphasize something that in some way he's not quite sure of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like he's created a pasture for all his horses, but those wild horses outside of the fence, even if they leap over occasionally and have intercourse with the ones inside the fence, they're not going to be allowed to stay.
Oh, right.
Is this making any sense?
Yeah.
See, I think the third dimension that paradoxically, and this is all part of the paradox, the third word I want to give you is religious. He's a profoundly religious man, but he does not subscribe either to anti-Christian creeds like unscientific cultic kind of religiosities, and he doesn't subscribe to Christianity as such. But nevertheless, several people in the book I've shown you say of him that no one they had ever met had a profounder religious spirit, a profounder sense of the mystery of existence. And I would say the fourth word, and it's hardly a definition, but it's a word that is very interesting to use about him. I think he was a man who exuded an extraordinary quality of love. Even though he hated as well and was ferocious, nevertheless, the depth of the love in him, I think, was quite extraordinary. And that love translated into an analytic power and depth of great intensity and skill, which I benefit from even now. But it was it was underlain by the sense of mystery and the sense of love. He was a mystery in himself. He was quite extraordinary. One would see him dashing through Cambridge. And it was like he'd got all the bats of hell after him. Occasionally he would come through Trinity Hall, but mostly he went through Clare College. And Raymond Williams has a fascinating article about him in this book called The Man Running. And what happened was that Leavis ran past Williams as they were walking on King's Parade. and he felt he'd insulted him. So he actually came back and apologized to him. I hope you don't think I was cutting you, Williams. Of course, old-fashioned language, but
Right.
nevertheless, and the ambiguity in that discussion Williams has, every so often Leavis, when they were discussing quietly to themselves, when they were phasing out in a faculty meeting that had got unusually boring at that particular point, they would be very subtly in agreement. And then Leavis would go back on it all when he made the next public statement. So there was a kind of game going on at one level. But nevertheless, that love, that mystery, for all the faults, for all the venom of the later years, for all the anti-CP Snow stuff and so on and so forth, and the later articles in the same line. The sense of mystery, the sense of awe, the sense of a religious depth to experience, which couldn't be accounted for by a belief system, was profound.
Mm.
And I cannot think of him without nearly tearing up because of how deep he meant, the depths he meant to me.
Mm.
And that depth is coming from that place of love and mystery. So I don't know if we've got our 3 words yet, but I think we're heading.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like what you're talking about is, and in political science jargon, there's a lot of charisma, which borrows from the divine, so that in the context of politics, a leader, and you can name them, Hitler, Mao, and anybody that has that ability to inspire people to obey or agree or whatever. It takes a certain kind of personality, but it's not personality in the sense of the word great means I like it. You can like them or you can hate them, but there's something, that connection with the otherworldly, for lack of a better word, religious.
The transcendent, maybe.
Yeah, that comes through, that attracts people. Even if they don't like a person, they can still be attracted because they feel they're in league with the divine in some way. And it sounds like what he's talking about when he talks about genius is that whether he likes the writing or not, he can perceive that individual has that connection.
As a kind of force.
Right. Well, like you said, life force, but it can be life.
It can be in a weird form. It doesn't have to be in the form that Leavis wanted to label it and fit it into. The horses outside the corral were still horses, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. And you can admire someone who is not in your corral, even though
in a kind of backhanded way, yes.
Well, you may not agree with them, but if they make sense and they have profound commitment to their belief system, there's just something about that makes them attractive to people, which is what answers the question why people get elected even though they're idiots. But like I say, that's looking at it in terms of politics.
Well, I would disagree a little bit with that, because if I think of D.H. Lawrence, when D.H. Lawrence spoke about the sense of wonder, he was only speaking about the sense of the positive attraction. And I don't know enough about Leavis, but I would imagine that it's the same. There isn't an admiration for the greatness of negative attraction, I don't think. So that there's a sense of ethics of a good and evil, and that not even the temptation of Milton, evil be thou my good. It doesn't seem to exist. I wouldn't have thought in Leavis, but probably Heward can correct me. I'm not sure. I did want to throw in one little question here. I don't know if you know the answer. Because I was intrigued by the thing about French literature, which I tend to agree with actually. But had Leavis read Francois Mauriac at all? Because it strikes me that Francois Mauriac does have some of that life force, as you've described it. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Le Noyer de Vipre, the Nest of Vipers, which I've read twice. I've happily read three times, and that does have that religious force in it, which is a little bit like maybe like Lawrence to me. I don't know, but otherwise, I just have a very true comment, I think, on a lot of French literature. It's sort of too clever by half and doesn't seem to have that really profound life affirmative element in it. But anyway, yeah.
Well, I don't know about Mauriac, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if Mauriac was part of a cluster of writers, Leavis would have read him.
I mean, Mauriac was also, I think, very much promoted by students of French literature in both school and certainly in universities. So it seems to be possible. Be interesting to know if he wrote about him, but maybe he would have thought Mauriac's style is, I don't know, but it just a name that came up.
He certainly would have known Baudelaire backwards.
Yes, yes.
And as I say, I think he also, paradoxically, I think he fully understands what Kant is up to.
I wanted to throw in one sort of slightly funny remark but maybe that Leavis is like, I think T.S. Eliot said something like this about Joyce, was it? That he might be, again, the word great writer, but he doesn't lead anywhere. There's nowhere further you can go with him. And maybe that's a little bit the same with Leavis in the sense that he did have, I can think of at least one really bad, in my opinion, extremely bad sort of imitator, and that's Harold Bloom writing the book, The Western Tradition, which you've probably read. I think it's a shockingly bad book and really comical, and it's almost like a parody of Leavis, I would say, where he makes these great writers who he defines as great, includes a lot of foreign writers, but he assesses them in terms of the translation. And I'm quite interested in the moment, the translation, and how can you judge writers when you've just on the basis of how they've been translated into English? And I think he includes Freud's lecture notes as great literature. It's really awful. I don't know if you've read this book, but maybe you
know of it. I've dipped into it, but you see, even that I would assume that something like Bloom's book, there will be some cherries in it somewhere.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, I didn't find them, but I was biased from the beginning, probably. I paid a lot of money and I expected something better, and I was very angry.
I think it would be good at the next meeting, perhaps, to read some words of this man himself. There are collections of his essays on writers easily available. Do you think that's a good idea, Michael? It would be good
I think that's an extremely good idea. I mean, it goes back, doesn't it, to what Heward said, that Leavis had read them, which I think is absolutely a significant comment. And how much, and so much today, people make comments on books in book reviews. I would say I would be prepared to bet $500 or euros that they had not read the book. Whether they're praising it or damning it is all to do with what their editor says or what. And so, yes, let's go to the text, and surely Leavis himself would approve of.
Exactly. That's the best way of honouring someone, isn't it? To hear what he has to say himself. And there's there are two collections of essays available I've seen. One is called The Great Tradition, and as I think at least one piece about Henry James, an author we have not touched on in Soteria, so that would perhaps be an appropriate thing to read, and I should like to do that.
Yeah, perhaps you would recommend any particular types, but I like the one with the suggestion something about Henry James, because you're quite right, we haven't.
It's available online, so that's good. I mean, in a digitized book version, so that's nice. Yeah,
I think one of the things that happened to Leavis in relation to James was he started out being very, very deeply impressed by the mid-period James. So the portrait of a lady, he relates to the account of Grand Court in George Eliot's last novel.
Daniel Deronda, is it?
Hmm?
Is it Daniel Deronda, the last?
Daniel Deronda, yes. So it's very clear that what Leavis thinks of as the good part of Daniel Deronda has had a massive influence on James's Portrait of a Lady. And there's also then the Bostonians. He doesn't like the Princess Casamassima, but I think the Princess Casamassima is, he's pretty angry with Lionel Trilling, by the way. But I think that Trilling's intrigue with the Princess Casamassima is correct, but there's a whole dimension politically there that is lurking around that Leavis isn't particularly interested in, and so forth. So I think he became much more interested in more transitional works like The Awkward Age and What Maisie Knew. And then he started moving on to the even later novels.
Did he admire What Maisie Knew? Because I thought that was the worst of James's books. I thought, what am I reading?
Yeah, he admired What Maisie Knew.
Oh.
Well, why not have a think? Maybe you were wrong and not
Oh,
Leavis.
absolutely. I'm just saying how don't get me. It's just my
Good point,
emotional
Dave.
reaction. I'm not making a. But I would love to hear somebody explain to me that What Maisie Knew is really a very profound novel and what I've misunderstood. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the other thing again, of course, is objective judgment and subjective reaction, which is another can of worms or a whole thing, a problem in itself. But yeah. Anyway, absolutely, I think Stead's idea is excellent.
So
I'm just approving of Stead's idea. I would maybe if you'd have a concrete proposal for what we could read from Heward, what you would think was most suitable for us. I see maybe we'll have one or two people more next time, maybe not. But if you have any sort of think this is the text they should read it because they haven't read, obviously we haven't read very much. I think I can speak for everybody of F.R. Leavis, but a little bit maybe, but not. Maybe Janine or Stead, maybe you have, but I'm imagining.
Let me have a think about
another thing. I mean, the of the people that he regarded as being geniuses, we certainly could read something in the future by T.F. Powers that I've not heard of him. That would be very interesting. T.S.
Oh, I think
Eliot,
you'd like him,
I don't
Stead. I
think
think
we
you'd
need,
like him.
you
I
know,
think you'd like
we're
him.
all familiar with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it'd be good to read something by Ludwig Wittgenstein. That would also, I think, be a nice addition and a good. I can see you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take that. Well, okay. Well, that's an interesting thing. The fact that I mean, you've read him and you don't like his work. You don't like the way he
I
writes
attempted to read some of
expresses himself.
Wittgenstein, and I don't like it when a writer is obviously more intelligent than I am. I find that very humiliating. And yes, I can well believe the man was arrogant. It comes through even when he's talking about number and color combinations. And also, I found it all excruciatingly boring. But yeah.
I'd like to read something by this Hopkins guy that was Judge.
Oh, that's very pleasant. Margaret, are you breathing over golden grove, unleaving leaves like heaven? It's lovely.
Yeah, he was a great man.
Because
I think.
I had a
So
question
we have great
about the meaning of that they didn't want to publish this because it wasn't proper, and I realized he's a priest, so but what exactly why didn't they want to publish it? And then he said, well, I wrote it down. Did I write it down? It's not proper content or something. And I'm wondering why. What was it there about uh, the wreck of Deutschland did they not like?
I suspect it had far too much mind about it than the poor little simple Catholic teachers of that particular part of the Roman Catholic Church at that point could tolerate. I think Hopkins was just far too clever. Do you know, this is not one that Leavis likes because it's a totally Christian poem, but I think it's one of the great incarnational poems ever written, and that is that nature is a Heraclitean fire and of the comfort of the resurrection. Anybody know that?
No.
What's it
You
called?
have a look at that.
Mm-hmm.
What's it called again?
That nature
Nature.
is a Heraclitean fire, as in the Greek philosopher, a Heraclitean fire,
Mhm.
and of the comfort of the resurrection.
Yeah, okay. How about that?
You probably find it on one of the Poetry Foundation, for example.
Mhm.
You find it easily online. You know when in Verdi's Requiem the tuba mirum begins to sound. Anybody know it?
Well, yeah, I know Verdi's Requiem. I wouldn't identify that particular part because I'm not a great, I don't have much intelligence to say about classical music, but I do know Verdi's Requiem. Yeah.
Well, when the tuba mirum comes in, it follows the Dies Irae,
Mm-hmm.
and we hear the trumpet sound, and we begin to hear the clashes with different trumpets sounding differently, and it gradually builds up and explodes until you have something like well, it's a very profound musical epiphany. You should treat yourself to it tonight. It's quite extraordinary. Well, Hopkins's poem for me is the literary equivalent of Verdi's Tuba Mirum.
Very good. Yeah.
As it were, you won't have to listen to Verdi if you read that nature is a Heraclitean fire and of the comfort of the resurrection.
As a title of a poem, it already sounds too intellectual for the most orthodox of the church. It's already a complex statement in itself, isn't it? Yeah.
He wasn't submitting that to the Society of Jesus.
Ah, yes, he said the Wreck of the Deutschland, yeah.
Well, I do understand it. I mean, you're talking Jesuits, so I'm sure they nitpicked everything, but so I'm interested in this guy Hopkins. I want to read stuff by him. I'll look him up and find something to read.
So don't
Just for
forget,
my own personal edification. He interests me.
Janine, don't forget also that Hopkins was suspect to the Society of Jesus. Do you know why?
Why?
Because he had been received into the Roman Catholic Church by none other than John Henry Newman. And as you know, John Henry Newman was a lately, who had written a quite extraordinary book, The Development of Christian Doctrine, to rationalize his conversion to Roman Catholicism. And he wasn't a cradle Catholic, and therefore he was, I would think, was permanently, until very late in his life, suspect to the whole Catholic community, including the Jesuits in Britain. Of course, that's a fascinating story, which I can't get enough of.
I'll have to look that up too.
Yes.
Because when I was a Catholic, I wasn't a babe or a Catholic from birth either. So
Folks, I don't know how much time we have. But one thing, of course, here maybe we do for another time. The obvious thing that you left out almost entirely was the C.P. Snow issue and the notion of science and practicality as opposed to the cultivation of the mind. And I find that debate and that confrontation quite fascinating, and perhaps we'll be able to go to it. And I would like to say one thing that occupies my mind at the moment is how little there is of that really intelligent debate, even if it's very antagonistic, where two people in public, and that the equivalent of the YouTube of their time was publishing these pamphlets and books in which they attacked each other, as I understand it, and really dealing with some of the most, I'm always going to use that word important, certainly some of the most fascinating issues of the day and still between science and literature. And I still think it's a fascinating debate. So maybe we have time for that next time, or what people feel.
Now, Aldous Huxley accused Leavis of literarism, but actually it's very clear that Leavis is not anti-science. Leavis would have accepted science as part of the corpus of the Western humane tradition, and as essential, even though, of course, he also has a parable about how industrial uses of science have completely destroyed traditional ways and so on and so forth, which is a somewhat exaggerated parable. But of course, there is, I mean, Trilling, I think, was quite right when he said they were basically, in a sense, two Puritan eggheads who hated one another. But in many ways, they had similarities that neither of them was prepared to recognize.
Well, they were both quite uncompromising, I think, and maybe the truth lies, I know it sounds a little bit cheesy, but maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Because it strikes me that one could see that in the past, education and the whole culture of Britain and the British Empire was very wrapped up in this idea of a literary cultural tradition and the ivory tower. And we've now gone to so much the other extreme, where all that matters is practicality, business and business career, and science, science, science. And really, science is the new religion. And maybe one should strike something a way in between, taking the best from Leavis and the best from Snow and acknowledging that they were both really rather extreme. That might be a way that I would suggest as a kind of reconciliation. I mean, because I'm sort of sympathetic to both in a way and at the same time reject both. So I find myself in a very ambivalent position with regard to this.
I think
I have
the club is called ambivalence.
What club? Sorry.
The club that you're part of and that we're probably all part of.
Okay.
You said that he obviously suffered trauma of the people that were who actually fought World War I. And I'm wondering or do you know, or did he write anything about how he felt about the World War I as like the demise of the rigid class system, aristocracy, monarchy? In other words, the passing of that kind of things that we associate with Britain. Did he write about that or mention anything about that?
I see in his preoccupation with analysis, as in literary analysis, he was so profoundly immersed in it that even though in casual remarks you suddenly knew he knew more history than he'd forgotten more history than you even knew of. I mean, he remarks casually in one of the later commentaries on T.S. Eliot, if I were to offer him a text that it might be useful to him, but these things are not necessarily possible to teach by books, I would recommend Halevi, which obviously Leavis must have read all of Halevi and presumably was reading Halevi when he was doing his historical doctorate, whose title I do not know to my chagrin.
Sorry, who was Halevi? I only know Halevi as an early biographer of Nietzsche, but I don't know any other Halevi.
He's a historian.
Okay.
French historian, and
oh, maybe he's the same one. It could be. I don't know. Yeah.
He begins with 1815, and he comes right the way through down to the early years of the 20th century.
Who is that, Michael? How do you, Halavian? What is that name?
Halevi.
Oh, Halevi. Okay.
Emil Halevi.
Emil. Okay. Okay. I'll have to look him up too.
Did Leavis read in foreign languages, or was he monolingual, or was he?
He was several lingual.
Mm-hmm.
He could read Dante in Italian.
Mm-hmm.
He certainly knew French. He knew a fair amount of German. I think he had probably read at least parts of Thomas Mann in German, I would say he was certainly trilingual, but he would also have been trilingual plus a bit of German, I suspect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because that enables him to make comment on French literature, which I think is probably true. Yeah. Okay, so Stead, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you're very quiet. I was. Is that a good point to wrap up? Definitely, we should
I thought I would leave it to you to decide when to fit, because you know what I'm like. I always tend to do things quicker than
yeah. But
so I thought, given the fact that there's no one has dropped out,
is fine.
Yeah, no one has dropped out because
no
normally
one's dropped
people
out.
do,
No,
but
indeed. No.
Because yeah, we just have one distinguished guest apart from the speaker. So, all right then. Should we should we all go to our respective Saturday evening suppers and
yeah, absolutely. But Stead, what about the reading for the next time? And would perhaps, I mean, it would be suitable for Heward to introduce that as well, probably. But obviously, it's a reading; it doesn't matter too much who introduces it. But
no, I mean, no, I mean,
we could correspond about that. I mean,
yeah, I was just going to say quickly, if we're meeting on Saturday, we can meet earlier, which might be more convenient for Janine. Maybe meeting an hour earlier.
Any time is good for me because I'm 5 hours behind you guys.
So yeah, that might be better.
It doesn't really matter to me when we meet.
What about? I mean, personally, for me, an hour earlier is a little bit better because it's an hour later.
Yeah, maybe 4:30. yeah, an hour early, that might be better. But yeah, I
What
mean,
about Heward? What?
Early is better for me.
Oh, early is better for you then, I think.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
All right, then maybe that in a few weeks, so we can
No,
sort
and
out.
I'm in the midst of a quite hectic time, but I will try and see what I can come up with as suggestions of
Well,
parts of Leavis's texts.
Hmm.
And do you want me to come up with any part? I could come up with a passage from D.H. Lawrence that would vindicate Leavis's claim that he's an important literary critic.
we've read some D.H. Lawrence. I think it'd be good to just read some Leavis. That's my view. And there are two books of his readily available in nice editions online. So I think we should just plunge in, maybe without thinking too much about which parts we're going to
Sorry,
read.
which books are those?
The Great Tradition, and
Yeah, I wrote
I'm
that
not
down.
sure what the other one is, but that's enough. There's more than enough in that to keep us reading.
Well, the trouble is with the
So,
Great Tradition is that, of course, it's harder for him to engage in really close analysis. If you go to revaluation, you are all new bearings.
well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, if you've got something that is online, you're welcome to suggest it. We can, yeah, you're welcome to
I think the
suggest it.
Common
So,
Pursuit is
certainly,
probably online as well.
Send me a link.
The Common Pursuit. Okay.
Yeah, yes, correct. Correct.
Okay.
All right, then.
So
Well,
maybe
thanks
Heward
again
can
so
send a
much,
few
Heward, for
suggestions, and
sharing
maybe
your.
Heward also.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly. We
maybe
can have
let
a
us
look
know
at
what
and
weeks
sit.
don't suit you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, see what
Yeah.
what we fancy. And yeah, I wish you well with your treatment. Yeah, we've all got various
Yes,
things
quite indeed, yes.
we're dealing with. Yeah, which which is
It's
particular
kind
to
of
us.
sad, isn't it? I mean, if it was all 50 years ago, we'd all be talking about, oh, he's not coming because he's so cut up because his girlfriend's left him or something.
Yeah, he was.
I know, it's all,
Drinking too
he's
much.
got a hernia.
Hospital
He's got,
appointments and stuff like that.
doctor's
I know.
appointments. Well, that's,
I know. I
that's the
think,
way it
but
is.
we must soldier on. All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Hugh. It's very good to share your personal
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
experience.
Yeah.
I think which is so valuable, given the
Really,
fact
really
that
like that. Yeah.
we haven't met him, and sometimes
I'm
the magic that people have
I'm one of the final generation that knew him.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed,
Must
indeed.
be, yeah.
And sometimes the particular magic that a person has is very difficult to put in a bottle and sort of preserve somehow,
Indeed,
except
so,
through
yes,
the
quite.
memories of
Yeah.
people that knew the person. I've been to so many funerals where the person is just not there at all, and it's just that that their character is somehow elusive. But all right, thanks so much for that, and yeah, thanks,
Yes,
Ginny,
thank you.
for coming. Your
Thank
support is
you.
always wonderful.
Yes, indeed.
And thanks, Michael, of course, for organising this. And wish everyone a good Saturday evening and good health as far as we're allowed to have it in our present state.
Well, Michael, you're going to send out emails, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Good deal.
Thanks so much. Bye bye, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.